The second possible reason that experimental empirical studies can go awry is called researcher degrees of freedom. Okay? So what is this about? It's also called data mining, p-hacking. These are sort of different flavors of it. Okay? But the main idea is that there are lots of ways that you can test a hypothesis or design an experiment, and every one of those involves a different probability calculation. What's the probability that your null result, which is usually the thing that is sort of the alternative to your preferred hypothesis, what's the probability that the null result generates the data, that the null hypothesis generates the data you observe purely by chance? Okay. The issue is that the more tests you perform, the higher the probability that one of those tests erroneously rejects the null hypothesis, which is a type called a type 1 error. And after the fact, it's easy to convince yourself that that test, the one that gave you the result you expected and that you want to be true, is also the best test, and that's the one that you should report and the one that you should have run all along. So let's look at an example. Again, using Richard Thaler's endowment experiment. So remember, in this there were 22 mugs distributed to 44 people. On average, 2.25 trades were made. Far less than 11, which would be predicted under the sort of standard null hypothesis that the endowment effect is not real and people's valuation for things like mugs is independent of their value. Now, for the sake of argument and for illustrating researcher degrees of freedom, let's suppose that the results were not so strong. Suppose that instead of 2.25 trades, there were actually 8 trades. Still less than 11, but unfortunately not much less than 11. In fact, if there were, remember you're distributing 22 mugs, so if 14 of them by chance go to people whose value of mugs is above the median, then you're only going to get 8 trades. And the probability that 14 out of 22 mugs go to people in the top half of the value distribution is actually 7%. So it's higher than 5%. And so this is not we would not really reject the null hypothesis. We'd be like, well, 8 is kind of interesting, but we would expect something like 8 trades to happen just purely by chance, even if the null hypothesis is right. But what if in this hypothetical where they only got 8 trades, the authors decide that actually, you know what we forgot? The endowment effect is probably impacted by gender. I mean, what isn't? So, we could come up with a story about why we would think men or women would be more prone to the endowment effect. So let's suppose that there are 22 students, half the students are women and half are men, and each gender actually happened to receive 11 mugs just by chance. And when you look at women, 6 out of the 11 mugs were traded, but for men, 2 out of the 11 were. The probability that 9 out of 11 mugs go to a male with above median valuation is only 3.3%. That's less than 5%. And so we would say, hey, the endowment effect works for men. It's really interesting, and we're going to plan to study further why the effect varies between genders, but this is really interesting, and it sort of flies in the face of conventional economic wisdom. But you see, what really happened here is that if you keep trying things, one of them by chance is going to stick. And in this case, they tried cutting it by gender, and it worked. But suppose that it didn't work for men versus women. They still got that there's no endowment effect. Well, maybe Richard Thaler and his co-authors think, you know what? It's because we're studying economists, and economists are trained not to have these biases, but we want the general population, so let's try it again, but without them. Or let's control by major and see if it differs between economists and everybody else. Or maybe they think it's actually about young people are less rational because their brains are still developing. So let's cut the sample up by age and see if young people exhibit the endowment effect. Or maybe they would think, actually, there's these various cultural differences across our student population. Maybe the U.S. students are really selfish. They value and they want to own and stuff. So let's see if we observe this effect when we divide it up among just the U.S. students versus the other world students. Or maybe it's a factor about your income, and maybe people who come from a rich background are more rational, and that's why they're richer. And so we would control for parent income. The point is that if you try enough things, something is going to stick. And even if none of that stuck, they could continue to tinker with their experiment until they got the results they expected. Maybe they would say, actually, this whole experimental design is wrong. Students don't typically drink coffee from mugs anymore, so they're not actually going to get attached to them. They use Starbucks cards. Instead, let's try it with some other object, and they just do the experiment again. Or maybe we need to have them all play that token game first instead of just 12, because they need to learn how the trade is going to work in this experiment. Or maybe it doesn't work because it's just too artificial, and they need to for the endowment effect to work, they need to actually experience using the object. So let's serve coffee in the mugs. The point is not that they did any of this. As I said, they didn't need to do any of this. They only, but it's easy to see how researchers have tons of freedom to design their experiments and to design how they're going to analyze it. And these are called their degrees of freedom. So it's sort of the different levels or directions they can go in their experiment. And when they have so many of these options, it's really easy to basically keep trying them until you find one that works. And it's not even that they're cynically trying to hunt for a publishable result. It's that they're convincing themselves that this is the best way to do it all along. And so as an example, a really famous recent study is Daryl Bem, who was a respected social psychologist at Cornell, and he was interested in ESP, which stands for extrasensory perception. This is supernatural stuff like being able to read other people's minds, to see the future, etc., etc. So Daryl Bem is this respected social psychologist. He made his name studying kind of conventional topics, but he's really got this interest in the side stuff. And over 10 years, while at Cornell, he conducted 9 experiments. Each one had at least 100 students, and in each experiment, he used gold standard research techniques for rigor because he was good. He knew how to run good experiments, and he was a respected guy in other fields. So, for example, here's how one of his experiments works. A participant sits at a computer, and they see, I'm going to make my screen bigger. They see 2 curtains, okay? They have to click on one of the curtains. I forgot how it goes. Yeah, all right. So they're supposed to guess which of these curtains has an erotic image behind it, okay? And then they're supposed to click. Once they click, that triggers within the computer a randomization algorithm where it randomly decides which of the 2 curtains actually is going to have an erotic image. And then they see if they were right or not. Now, because the computer only decides which of those 2 curtains you click on has this erotic image, after you clicked, the only way to do better than chance is if people have the ability to see into the future. Okay? As a side note, why is it erotic images? Why is he showing students porn? It's because he had this idea that if we can see into the future, it had to evolve in the past for reasons that would help us, like survive and thrive. And he figured it had to be something like very primal and primeval for this thing to take up. And the desire for sex is really deep in our nature. So that's why he used porn or erotic images. I haven't seen them. I don't know what they're like. Okay. The point is that he found people did get the right answer more often than chance. The effects were small, but 53% of guesses were correct. That's significant. He had enough students that the chances that would occur just by chance were less than 5%. Okay? So this is Daryl Bem. So Bem was so careful. He ran lots of versions of the experiments, many replications, that he got his results published in the top journal for his field, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which only accepts 15% of papers. His goal for doing all this was that he's going to finally convince the world to take extrasensory perception seriously. He's done the work, 10 years, thousands of student participants, gold standard social psychology methodology, proving that ESP is real. But it didn't work, at least according to Bem's plan. Instead, the takeaway for most people is ESP cannot be real. Instead, what must be wrong is the methods that we think are so good in social psychology. Okay. Replications of his experiments were immediately planned by outside researchers, and on the whole, his results have not replicated successfully. People have not been able to find evidence for extrasensory perception. So what happened? Well, this is still being debated, but it looks like this was a case of researcher degrees of freedom. So how Bem would typically work is he would pre-test his experiments with a small number of participants. Remember, from his perspective, he's trying to uncover these very subtle effects, and you shouldn't just expect that any random experiment you do is going to be powerful enough to discover this. So what he would do is he would tweak his experiments, get a group of, say, 15 students, a small number of students, and test it on them. And if the results looked promising, he would continue the experiment. Okay? So for example, we could imagine in his curtain experiment, maybe he initially tried food behind each curtain, or maybe originally he just picked random images like, you're looking for like the blue square instead of the red square. And it didn't work, and he thought deeply, is like, why is this not working? It must be because people don't care about blue squares or red squares. I've got to do something that they do care about. So he picked erotic images, but maybe that was after he had done the experiment a number of times in different ways. When he finds one that's promising, so he is doing this on a small group of 15 students, and suddenly he gets really good results for this small group. So he's like, aha, I've zeroed in, I found the experimental design that works. And then he expands the sample to like 100 students. The issue is that, since if he designed his experiments where if you keep the ones that basically look really promising and then add a bunch of students, you still have those, you still have that really strong initial result. Okay. And that can basically persist as you add more and more people. So by dropping and retaining his experiments in this kind of biased manner, he skewed his sample. So for example, suppose he tested it on 20 students and he got 15 able to guess correctly, and then he added another 80 students, and of the remaining 80, it was exactly random chance. 40% did it one way, 40% did it 40% were right, not 40. 40 out of 80 students were right, 40 out of 80 students were wrong. But if you add the original 15 that got it right in, suddenly you look like you've got 55 out of 100 that can guess correctly. No one really accuses Bem of fraud or anything like that. No one thinks that he was sloppy. It's just that this offense, or this issue of researcher degrees of freedom, was not sufficiently appreciated for how badly it can go wrong. One expression I've heard is that people thought of it like jaywalking, we know you're not supposed to do that, but it's not that big a deal. But it turns out it is that big a deal. It's not jaywalking, it's murder. Okay. All right, so what do you do about it? Well, one way to solve this is through what's called pre-registration. This requires the researcher to completely specify the research plan before they begin the research experiments and data. They cannot see the results and then decide how they're going to do it. They have to instead specify in advance, this is the experiment I'm going to run, this is what I'm going to look for. Okay. And if you do that correctly, you remove all your degrees of freedom.